I own an actual underground tunnel running beneath an HOA's construction site, and nobody remembered it existed until I locked both ends. If you love watching entitled HOAs realize too late what they never actually controlled, subscribe now, because this one ends with a multi-million-dollar project grinding to a complete stop. I own a tunnel, an actual underground tunnel running directly beneath an HOA construction site. Nobody remembered it existed until the day I locked both ends and watched an entire multi-million-dollar project grind to a complete stop. 3 weeks later, the HOA's own engineers were the ones telling them they had no choice but to come beg me for permission. If you love watching entitled HOAs discover too late that they never actually controlled what they thought they did, subscribe now, because this story ends with a construction crew standing around with nothing to do and a board that never saw it coming. I inherited the tunnel almost by accident, buried inside paperwork nobody in my family had looked at closely for nearly 40 years. My grandfather had built it back in the 1970s, a private underground passage connecting two sections of land he owned on either side of what was then just an empty stretch of undeveloped countryside, used mainly for moving equipment between his properties without going around a long access road. Decades passed. My grandfather passed away. The land eventually got divided up between family members, sold off in pieces, developed over time into what slowly became a sprawling residential community. Somewhere in that process, the tunnel simply got forgotten, buried both literally and figuratively beneath layers of changing property lines and new construction that had no idea it was even there. I only found out about it myself when I inherited a small remaining parcel from my grandfather's original estate tucked between two larger sections of what was now Brookhaven Ridge, a mid-sized HOA community that had been expanding steadily for years. The parcel itself seemed unremarkable at first. A narrow strip of land, mostly unused, sitting awkwardly between two developed sections of the neighborhood. I nearly considered selling it immediately, assuming it held little value beyond whatever the HOA might offer to absorb it into their expansion plans. Then I found the old blueprints folded carefully inside a box of my grandfather's belongings my mother had kept in storage for decades. A full underground tunnel running directly beneath what was now Brookhaven Ridge's newest phase of construction, connecting the parcel I now own to a section of land the HOA had recently acquired for their long-planned community center project. I sat with those blueprints for a long time, genuinely unsure what to make of them. A forgotten tunnel, still technically part of my inherited property, running underneath land the HOA was currently developing. Curious more than anything else, I drove out to the parcel myself, walking the property line carefully until I found exactly what the blueprints described. A concrete entrance, mostly overgrown, hidden behind decades of untouched brush, but structurally intact enough that I could tell immediately it hadn't collapsed or deteriorated the way I initially expected. I contacted a structural engineer, someone experienced specifically with older underground constructions, to assess whether the tunnel was even still usable or simply an interesting historical curiosity worth documenting before eventually filling it in. His assessment surprised me. The tunnel remained structurally sound, built with reinforced concrete far sturdier than typical construction from that era, likely because my grandfather had originally used it to move heavy equipment safely between properties. More importantly, he confirmed something that immediately caught my attention. The tunnel's exact positioning ran directly beneath the foundation site for Brookhaven Ridge's new community center, currently under active construction. I pulled county property records that same week, tracing the tunnel's legal ownership carefully. According to every document I could find, the underground tunnel remained entirely part of my inherited parcel, never formally transferred, sold, or included in any of the property divisions that had created the HOA's current development, which meant the HOA was currently building a multi-million-dollar community center directly above private property they didn't actually own, without any legal easement, agreement, or permission whatsoever. I sat with that realization for days, unsure exactly what I wanted to do with information that suddenly felt far more significant than I'd initially expected. I hadn't set out looking for leverage over an HOA's construction project, but I'd apparently found something that could stop their entire multi-million-dollar development in its tracks simply by exercising rights I'd legally owned this entire time, buried quietly beneath a community that had no idea it was standing directly on top of somebody else's forgotten property. I spent the following week consulting with a property attorney, methodical, detail-oriented man named Gregory, who specialized specifically in complex boundary and easement disputes involving older, poorly documented properties. "This is genuinely unusual," he said, reviewing the blueprints and county records I'd gathered. "Most tunnel or underground rights disputes involve utility easements or mineral rights, not literally forgotten private infrastructure sitting directly beneath active construction. So, legally, where do I actually stand? Based on everything here," Gregory said, "the tunnel remains part of your inherited parcel. There's no recorded easement granting Brookhaven Ridge any rights to the space above, below, or through it. If their construction is relying on structural support connected to or interfering with your tunnel in any way, that potentially creates significant legal exposure for their entire project." That last part caught my attention immediately. "What do you mean by structural support?" Gregory pulled up the blueprints again, tracing the tunnel's path carefully against the community center's foundation plans, which I'd obtained through public construction permit records. "Depending on soil composition and how their foundation was engineered," he said, "it's entirely possible their construction team either didn't know about the tunnel at all or assumed it was simply an old utility corridor that had been properly abandoned and filled. If they built without accounting for it properly, and it turns out your property rights extend into space they're currently relying on structurally, this could become a serious problem for them very quickly." I hired the same structural engineer who'd initially assessed the tunnel to take a closer look specifically at how Brookhaven Ridge's new foundation had been constructed relative to the tunnel's exact positioning. His findings, delivered nearly 2 weeks later, confirmed something that turned this entire situation from an interesting legal curiosity into something with real, immediate consequences. The community center's foundation had been designed assuming stable, undisturbed soil beneath it. Their engineers had apparently either missed the tunnel's existence entirely during their site assessment or dismissed old records referencing it as irrelevant, outdated information from decades-old land use that no longer applied. Except the tunnel was still there, fully intact, running directly beneath a significant portion of their new foundation, creating exactly the kind of unstable underground condition proper foundation engineering was specifically designed to account for and avoid. "If this tunnel remains sealed and undisturbed," my engineer explained, "it's probably fine long-term. But any additional construction activity, particularly heavy equipment vibration or additional load-bearing work planned for upcoming phases, could potentially create serious structural risk given how their foundation currently interacts with this space." I sat with that information for a long time, understanding finally settling into place. This wasn't simply about legal ownership anymore. This was about an HOA currently constructing a multi-million-dollar building directly above an unstable underground void they didn't even know existed, using foundation engineering that had never properly accounted for it. I debated internally for days about exactly how to handle this. Part of me considered simply reaching out quietly, informing Brookhaven Ridge's board of the situation, offering to formalize an easement agreement that would let their project continue safely while properly compensating me for what was, after all, still legally my property. But something about the situation made me hesitate, curiosity building about how exactly an HOA would respond to news like this, especially one that had spent months publicly celebrating this exact project as a major community achievement. I decided to test something first before making any formal contact. I drove out to my tunnel entrance, still hidden behind decades of overgrown brush, and installed a simple, sturdy lock on the concrete access point, sealing it completely for the first time in what was likely decades. I wasn't blocking anything actively happening at their construction site. I was simply, quietly, formally asserting control over property that was legally mine, exercising a right I genuinely possessed. I had no idea at that point exactly how significant that simple action was about to become. 3 days later, I got a call from Gregory, his voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard from him previously throughout our entire process. "You need to see this," he said. "Brookhaven Ridge just filed an emergency stop work order on their own construction site." I sat there stunned for a moment, processing what Gregory had just told me. They filed a stop work order on their own project. Their construction company did, actually, Gregory clarified. According to the filing, their engineers detected unexpected settling and pressure changes near the foundation's eastern section within the past 48 hours. They're citing safety concerns significant enough to halt all active construction until a full geological assessment can be completed. The timing wasn't lost on either of us. Exactly 3 days after I'd sealed that tunnel entrance for the first time in decades, their construction site had apparently begun experiencing exactly the kind of structural instability my engineer had warned might eventually occur. "Is this because of the tunnel?" I asked. "I can't say for certain without seeing their actual engineering reports," Gregory said carefully. "But given everything we already know about how that tunnel interacts with their foundation, it would be a significant coincidence if it's completely unrelated." I spent the next several days simply watching from a distance, curious how Brookhaven Ridge would handle a sudden, unexplained construction emergency that their own team apparently couldn't immediately diagnose. I got my answer through an unexpected source. A woman named Diane, who lived in the established section of Brookhaven Ridge and had apparently heard through neighborhood gossip that construction had mysteriously stopped, reached out to me directly after somehow learning I owned adjacent property near the community center site. "I heard you might know something about why construction stopped," she said during our phone call, her tone genuinely curious rather than accusatory. "People are saying there's some kind of underground issue nobody can explain." I hesitated, unsure exactly how much I wanted to share before formally contacting the HOA myself. "I can't speak to their specific engineering reports," I said carefully, "but I do own a piece of property near that site with some interesting history." "What kind of history?" I explained briefly the tunnel's existence, its connection to my inherited property, and its unfortunate positioning directly beneath their new foundation. Diane went quiet for a long moment. "Nobody on the board has mentioned anything like that," she finally said. "As far as most residents know, this is just some unexpected soil issue they're calling a rare geological anomaly." That phrase, rare geological anomaly, told me exactly how Brookhaven Ridge's board was currently choosing to frame this situation publicly, likely hoping to avoid the more complicated truth of exactly why their multi-million-dollar community center project had suddenly ground to a complete halt. I decided it was finally time to formally contact the HOA directly, rather than continuing to let speculation and vague explanations circulate among residents who genuinely had no idea what was actually happening beneath their own community. Gregory drafted a formal letter informing Brookhaven Ridge's board of my property ownership, the tunnel's legal standing, and its direct structural relationship to their current construction issues. We sent it via certified mail, ensuring there would be no question later about exactly when they'd received accurate information about the situation. 3 days after that letter arrived, I received a call from someone identifying himself as Brookhaven Ridge's HOA board president, a man named Richard Alderman, his tone carrying the specific blend of forced calm and barely controlled urgency I recognized immediately from previous encounters with HOA leadership facing problems they hadn't anticipated. "We received your letter," he said. "I think we need to discuss this situation directly as soon as possible." "I'm available," I said simply. "Our engineers are reviewing everything you've provided," he continued, his tone shifting slightly, "but based on preliminary analysis, it appears your property may be directly connected to the structural issues we've been experiencing. That's consistent with what my own engineer found." I said. There was a long pause. "We'd like to discuss options for resolving this quickly. Our construction timeline is significantly impacted, and every day this remains unresolved costs the association considerable money." I felt something shift in that moment, understanding fully settling into place. Richard wasn't calling to argue or threaten legal action or dismiss my concerns the way I might have expected from previous HOA encounters I'd heard about through other stories like this. He was calling because his entire multi-million-dollar project depended entirely on my willingness to cooperate, and he knew it. "I'm willing to discuss a formal resolution," I said carefully, "but it needs to properly account for the property rights I actually hold here." Richard's tone grew noticeably more careful. "What exactly did you have in mind?" I hadn't fully decided what I wanted going into that conversation, but Richard's question forced me to think quickly and clearly about exactly what a fair resolution actually looked like. "I'm not interested in stopping your project permanently," I said honestly. "I understand this community center matters to a lot of residents who've been looking forward to it. But I own that tunnel and the property connected to it legally and completely, and any resolution needs to properly recognize that." "What are you proposing specifically?" Richard asked. "A formal easement agreement," I said, "properly compensating me for allowing your construction to continue safely above my property, along with covering the cost of whatever structural reinforcement your engineers determine is necessary to account for the tunnel going forward." Richard was quiet for a moment. "That could be a significant expense, depending on what reinforcement is required." "That expense exists because your construction team built without properly accounting for existing infrastructure that was clearly documented in old county records. If anyone had bothered checking thoroughly before breaking ground," I said, "I didn't create this problem. I simply own property your project happens to depend on." He didn't argue that point, which told me he understood exactly how weak his position actually was. Over the following 2 weeks, Gregory and Richard's own attorney negotiated the specific terms of a formal easement agreement, working alongside both engineering teams to determine exactly what structural reinforcement would be necessary to safely stabilize the community center's foundation, given the tunnel's confirmed presence beneath it. The final engineering assessment revealed something that made the entire situation even more consequential than initially expected. The tunnel wasn't just creating minor settling issues. Given its exact positioning and the specific soil composition beneath Brookhaven Ridge's new construction, continuing without proper reinforcement risked significant structural failure within the community center's projected 50-year lifespan, the kind of long-term risk that could have eventually resulted in serious safety concerns for residents using the building for decades to come. In other words, I hadn't just discovered a minor legal technicality complicating their construction timeline. I'd potentially prevented a serious structural safety issue from being built directly into a community building that hundreds of residents would eventually use regularly for meetings, events, and gatherings for decades into the future. The final agreement, once formalized, included a substantial one-time payment for the easement itself, along with Brookhaven Ridge covering the full cost of specialized foundation reinforcement, estimated at just over $300,000, significantly more than their original construction budget had allocated for unexpected structural adjustments. Richard presented the situation to Brookhaven Ridge's full board and eventually to residents during a community meeting, framing it carefully as an unexpected but ultimately positive discovery that allowed us to properly address a structural concern before it became a genuine safety issue. I attended that meeting myself, curious how residents would actually react once they understood the full scope of what had happened. The reaction surprised me, honestly, rather than anger directed at me for causing what many might have initially assumed was unnecessary delay and expense. Most residents seemed genuinely relieved once they understood the alternative, a community center potentially built with serious undiscovered structural risk. One that might not have surfaced until years later, possibly after the building was already filled with people during a community event. Diane, the resident who'd first reached out to me during the initial construction stoppage, approached me after that meeting. "I'm honestly glad you found this before it became something much worse," she said. "Nobody wants to think about what might have happened if that tunnel had eventually failed with the building already finished and full of people." Construction resumed nearly 6 weeks after that initial stop work order, this time with proper reinforcement engineering accounting fully for the tunnel's presence, along with a formally recorded easement agreement protecting both my property rights and the community's safe use of their new building for decades to come. I still own that tunnel today, sealed permanently now with reinforced concrete on both ends, structurally supporting rather than threatening the building constructed carefully above it. Brookhaven Ridge's community center opened 8 months later than originally planned, but opened safely, properly engineered, and without the serious structural risk that would have otherwise remained hidden beneath residents' feet for potentially decades. Sometimes the things we inherit without fully understanding turn out to matter more than we ever expected, and sometimes an entire community's safety depends entirely on someone curious enough to actually read the old paperwork nobody else bothered opening for 40 years. If this story hit you the way it hit me telling it, make sure you're subscribed, because the next HOA story I bring you might uncover something even more unexpected than a forgotten tunnel.